Good morning, everyone, and welcome back. We are on part 2 of Dr. Beeman's speaker series related to the ACE study. And last time in part 1, she reviewed some data related to a sample that was like in California. And there were concerns about maybe the sample and does it really generalize to a bunch of other folks and et cetera. So it sounds like in that particular session, Dr. Beeman mentioned that she will now go to the Philadelphia ACE study, which then takes that original study and puts it now more in an urban setting with diverse populations and see if the results still hold up or are different, right? So Dr. Beeman, the stage is all yours.
I'm going to try to make this big, and you're going to see in a minute why I'm saying that, because some of the slides, but then that means I can't see the chat. So help me out with that, Kevin, if anything. We're a small group, so you might even just want to turn on the microphone. First of all, I want to make sure everybody can hear me, and I want to thank everybody for coming or even listening. I had a tremendous outreach after the last one of people who listened but were unable to come. So thank you if you're listening, but we're unable to come. That's great too, and I appreciate it. So this is the second in a 4-part series about the Philadelphia Urban ACE Study. And I think that the first ACE study has been well circulated and is popular and people have heard of it. But when I talk about this, even among my students who should know better, they're like, what Philadelphia Urban ACE Study? It's like it didn't get the publicity that the earlier study got. So today we're going to drill down and really get to know that second Philadelphia ACE study. But I always start with a land acknowledgement. This beautiful blanket, I took a photo of this at the Cherokee Trading Post, which I highly recommend, in Seviersville, Tennessee, where the Cherokee Nation brings things for sale. I cannot go to Seviersville, Tennessee without stopping there. Ask my husband. We pull over every time. But isn't this a beautiful work of art? And what it symbolizes is the coming together of fabric. But we come together as a fabric, as a nation. We come together as a fabric of people. We come together as a fabric in academia. And that was all shown to us by the indigenous people who first settled this Turtle Island, as I talked about last time. So let's acknowledge that great contribution. This is a picture of me. If you haven't seen me before, I'm the Chief Nurse Administrator of the School of Nursing and Health Sciences at wonderful Aspen University. I am a forensic nurse, and people sometimes ask, what is a forensic nurse? And quite simply, forensic nurses care for people who have been victims of violence or trauma, which is exactly what we're talking about today. Sounds really esoteric when you say forensic nurse, but there are many, many, many people in this country and elsewhere that are victims of violence and trauma. So I will always have work to do. I also serve as a parish nurse in Nelson County of Virginia. And many of my parishioners have been victims and are now survivors of trauma and violence. So, the rubber actually hits the road. I actually am caring for people who fall into this category. So what is the session goal? And that is that understanding the findings of the original ACE study and today the Philadelphia Urban ACE studies, they'll help us to understand the long-lasting impact of violence on children. I was reflecting this weekend when I was so thrilled to hear about the little 4-year-old Israeli-American girl who, watched her parents get slaughtered in an act of violence and ran to the house next door to try to survive it, and then was captured and held hostage for way too long and has now been returned to the survivors in her family. And, that's going to have a lifelong impact on that child if there isn't early intervention going on right now. So we need to look at the lasting impacts. And if you don't think that there aren't children in this country who have had impacts of violence, wait till you take this study and sort of see, what happens, unfortunately, everywhere in the world that impacts small children. So we'll examine the upsurge of violence in our communities and maybe create some positive change so that we can help people who have already experienced violence to work through it in a positive way, but also so maybe we can reduce the violence and protect our communities because we're all part of communities. So today, November the 28th, we're going to talk about the Philadelphia Urban ACE Study, its findings and its impact. And actually, I hope everybody has, I want to say pencil and paper because I'm a baby boomer, but you might have a notebook, you might have a napkin, some way of writing down numbers, maybe a calculator, because we're going to actually walk through it. I'm not going to ask you your number, but you can walk through the Urban ACE Study yourself and just sort of see, hey, what's your score, right?
Mhm.
And then we're going to look at the findings and the impact that it had. So, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time to think about it because next week we're going to look at community violence as an actual public health crisis. It is just that ubiquitous, and I'll be sharing some prevalence statistics and just looking at, wow, what is going on here in Turtle Island, right? And then the good news is right before the holidays, we're going to have some solutions, and I really hope that those of you that are actively participating, and maybe even those that are listening and want to join us, if you join us for one session, please let it be that one so that we can all come up with a chance to fix it, right?
Mhm.
So as a review, for those of you that weren't here or those of you who have forgotten, too much eggnog, I don't know. We last time talked about the original ACE study. Again, I thought this was pretty weaving of color together. It was originally done in 1995 to 97. Now, when you talk to people, they act like it's somehow referring to the present day. But as you remember, we had a robust discussion that really, if you're talking about people who were in their 60s and half of them were 60 or older, they were actually kids in like the 30s or to the 50s. And so it was really reflecting the culture, the violence, the neglect in the 30s to the 50s, which is pretty old news if you think about it, but it was done in the 95 to 97. And this is what it looked like as sort of a reminder. It looked at abuse, emotional, physical, and sexual as they defined it at the time. For those of you that haven't listened to the recording or weren't here, we talked about how physical abuse, spanking kids was just, hey, that's what you just did. It was really part of the culture in a lot of cultures at that time. And awareness has changed since the 90s, but certainly in the 30s to 50s, there was physical abuse, but was there emotional abuse? And actually not much in the study was found, and not much sexual abuse, although more of women than men. And then they look at what they categorize as household challenges, that the mother was significant. Remember, the mother was sort of the center of the household in those days. And if she was treated violently, it pushed, grabbed, slapped, whatever, that had an impact on the child because the child looked to the mother for safety. And if mom can't guarantee safety, it's back to Maslow, then who can guarantee my safety? I can't turn to mom for safety, who was the first person, who cuddled me when I was born, then I'm not safe. So seeing mother treated violently and she can't protect herself had an impact on the child. And then substance abuse, we think it's a new thing. Not from that study. There was a lot of substance abuse even then, a lot of mental illness, even though I don't think it was talked about. It certainly showed up on the study. And then there was divorce. Remember, there was, about 1 in 4 at that point were divorcing or separating. And then incarcerated household members. And all of those are challenges to children who are growing up in those households. And then there was also emotional and physical neglect. And surprisingly, for that time period, I would have thought that there would be like more neglect, when you think about that time period. But people, I guess, maybe, put their energy in not neglecting their children. So then the good news of the study is that it did actually, despite the fact that it looked at 17,000 people that primarily could afford HMO insurance in California, it did have some findings that then I think has impacted our knowledge of the lasting impact of early adversity on traumatic brain injury, fractures, burns, depression, anxiety, suicide, PTSD, unintended pregnancies, their complications, fetal death, HIV, sexually transmitted diseases, cancer, diabetes, alcohol and drug abuse, unsafe sex, and other risky behaviors. And then the lack of opportunity to get education, therefore be in poverty and keep the cycle all over again. Those of you that were here last time, would you like to add anything to these review slides for people who might be listening? No? Okay. I guess there's nothing in the chat. So I'll move on. These were the issues that we looked at the original study last time, that things have changed quite a bit since 1997. And this looked at people who were insured. It didn't look at the unhoused. It didn't look, remember, in 1997, at people who weren't insured. It didn't even examine, well, these are all people who made the choice for an HMO. It didn't tease out, well, what about people who, at that time, you had a PPO where you had to choose your provider, might have had different results there. We did talk about, is Southern California really representative of the entire United States? And perhaps it isn't. And then we looked at, and Mary and I both got into a discussion about, it might be better to divorce if the family is so dysfunctional. Okay, you get one ding, right? Well, my parents divorced, but then you aren't subjected to all the other things, all the other drama, we'll call it, in the household, that it's almost protective to have a divorce. Whereas back in those days, they considered it, as part of this ACE study, to be, something that impacted children, to have a divorce. And certainly, probably financially, it may well have, because the person who was maybe divorced and left with children, therefore was left with less income. So it might have had that impact. We also were, I think, highly critical of the ethnicity skew, in that there were very few Black participants. And so you really missed capturing some good ethnic data. And then, as I pointed out earlier, 46.4% were over 60. So when you're saying what happened to you before you were 18, you're really capturing very old data. There was a high rate of college education in that survey. And is that really indicative of the current, or even then, the average American household at that time? And then there was a pretty low amount of incarceration, whereas now there's a pretty high amount of incarceration. And we talked about our women now leaving abusive relationships, which might skew that score in the other direction, in that those children would say, yeah, my parents divorced, boy, I'm really glad, but then they didn't have the other 9 that they had growing up. And more people aware of abuse. Kevin brought up last time, well, did they even think that was abuse? They may not have, but reflecting back 60 years later with the definitions that were given to them, they saw it as abuse when it wasn't. I remember having a discussion with my dad when he was alive of, that was abuse. I mean, back in that day, that was what they did. That was culture. They spanked kids, and he lived long enough to hear that called abuse. And he was really thinking through, wow. But it was a cultural change. So how has the Affordable Care Act maybe changed access to care? And then what was the non-household, the community violence and dysfunction? And that's what we're going to look at today, because that's what drove the second study. Trying to figure out how to advance the slides. Here we go. That was the Philadelphia project. It's a modern project, had a more diverse sample, and it found some really interesting data. So why did they choose to do an expanded study? Why don't we use this really old study from the 1990s? Well, during the initial convenings of the Philadelphia ACE project, I wonder if an urban area on the East Coast, that's where Philadelphia is, might have different stresses that aren't really noted in the original ACE study, which was on the West Coast, which really drill down into household adversities and didn't talk about community level ones. So in the period from 2012 to 2013, that's still 10 years ago, folks, but it's the most modern one we've got. They ran this study in conjunction with the Public Health Management Corporation's Household Health Survey, and they had 1,784 adult participants, which, if you'll note, is almost exactly the amount that the original ACE study had. So in terms of numbers, good job. They came up with about the same amount of adult participants as the original ACE study, but they took the original 10 questions, if you'll remember, and they added 5 additional community level stressors because they wanted to see what happens when they're community stressors, and how do people, rate that. So the method was they surveyed the adult participants in Philadelphia about those original 10 and the 5 additional ones. But here's the key. It was more socioeconomically and racially diverse, which I think this group, that's meeting for these sessions would be happy about, because we were sort of unhappy last week, weren't we? That it wasn't very socioeconomically and racially diverse. But because they were urban, maybe they were able to really get a very good sample. And they looked at the household and the expanded community level ones. And you're going to see in a minute, they're pretty expansive. They also did not see how short the survey could be. I think originally in the 90s, they were novel. They just wanted 10 quick questions that they could deliver. So they're asking a very expanded survey. You'll see in a minute. And what they're looking at is not only the 10 things inside your household, but have you ever witnessed violence? Have you ever felt discrimination? Have you ever had an adverse neighborhood experience, been bullied, or lived in foster care? Now, let me give you a personal example of this. I think some of you already know this. But in June of 1967, I was living in Damascus, Syria, in the Middle East. I have a 0 ACE study from the original ACE study. I lived in a happy little home. It was a Quaker household, so we didn't beat up on each other. We didn't call each other names. It was a 0 on the original ACE study. But on that June, I was bombed and escaped across the border to Lebanon, where again, I escaped to an airport which was bombed. And then I escaped to Greece, where I was injured, ended up at a United States Air Force hospital. Because I was injured, I was on the list of injured evacuees. And my father, who by that time was in Italy and looking for me, was able to find me because they had a list of the people who had been injured. And at that point, I'd been injured. And so then I was evacuated to Rome. But I would say I was without a home. I was without a country, right? I had reunited with my family, which was good. And finally ended up back in the United States. But here's a person who had a really idyllic family life, who had to witness violence and at a very young age. Now that impacted me in a way that I always felt like I wanted to help people who were unfortunate. And I will tell you, I work with the International Rescue Committee. I did my dissertation on disaster mitigation. I'm a public health volunteer. As I said, I'm a parish nurse. But can you see how that moment in time impacted me, even though I have a 0 ACE score from the original ACE study? So what I'm telling you is that you might not have a household problem, but you might have a community problem. Does that make sense? And that's what this study looked at. Do we have people who would say readily, oh, I had a wonderful childhood, but they lived in an environment in which they had exposure to some really violent situations? And I dare say that, this little girl in Gaza and Israel falls into that. She probably had a happy little home where she was very beloved. But now she has not only witnessed violence, she's felt discrimination. She certainly watched her neighborhood blow up. She was bullied, and she was kidnapped. I don't know if that's foster care, but things would show up on this study that would not show up on the other study. Does that make sense? Okay, any comments about these five? Would you guys pick anything else? Did they miss anything? Well, let me walk you through it, and then we'll see if at the other end of it you feel like, and then I will tell you the results. You feel like it. So get out your pen and paper. I am not going to ask you for these results, but I think it's sort of good for you to see these questions. This is not quick. There are a lot of questions that they had. But what you want to do is focus on the first 18 years of your life. So, and they also didn't just say yes or no. There are gradations. So, did you feel safe in your neighborhood? So, if you overall felt safe, okay, all of the time you get a 1. Most of the time you get a 2. Some of the time you get a 3. None of the time you get 4. So are you seeing the trend? The higher number? None of the time. If you never felt safe, that's a higher number. If you don't know or you cannot read or you refuse, then you do a D or an R. Okay, so first question, record the number, or, you know, I know you can read. 1 to 4 on that. Okay, the second one, did you feel the people in your neighborhood looked out for each other, stood up for each other, and could be trusted? And again, all of the time? 1, 2 would be most of the time, 3 would be some of the time, and 4 would be none of the time. Number 3, how often were you bullied by a peer or a classmate? 1, all of the time. 2, most of the time. 3, some of the time. And 4, none of the time. Number 4, how often, if ever, did you see or hear somebody being beaten up, stabbed, or shot in real life? Would you say 1, many times, 2, few times, 3, once, 4, I never saw anybody beaten up or shot, stabbed, otherwise hurt. All right. So now they want you to think about your childhood in general, not just your neighborhood or community. So while you were growing up in the first 18 years of life, how true were each of the following statements? There was someone in your life who helped you feel important or special. You know, back to Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. Were there helpers, okay? Was this 1, very often true? 2, often true? 3, sometimes true? And 4, rarely. Number 6, your family sometimes cut the size of meals or skipped meals because there just was not enough money in the budget for food. Was this 1, very often true? 2, often true? 3, sometimes true? And 4, rarely true? And 5, never true. Sometimes people are treated badly, not given respect, or are considered inferior because of the color of their skin, because they speak a different language or have an accent, or because they come from a different country or culture. While you were growing up in the first 18 years of your life, how often did you feel that you were treated badly or unfairly because of your race or ethnicity? Would you say 1, very often true, 2, often true, 3, sometimes, 4, rarely, and 5, never? Again, I want to remind you that the next questions refer to the time period while you were growing up in the first 18 years of your life. So during those first 18 years, did you live with anyone who was depressed or mentally ill? Yes, 1, no, 2. And then number 9, did you live with anyone who was suicidal? 1, if yes, 2, if no. And number 10, did you live with anyone who was a problem drinker or alcoholic? 1, yes, 2, no. All right, still looking at the first 18 years of your life. They keep reminding you through this study. Number 11, did you live with anyone who used illegal street drugs or who abused prescription medications? 1, yes. 2, no. And you also could have D for you might not have known, and that don't know, not sure. Did you live with anyone who served time or was sentenced to serve time in prison, jail, or other correctional facility? 1, yes. 2, no. And again, you might not have known. 13, you probably would know this one. Were you ever in foster care during the first 18 years of your life? 1, yes. 2, no. And there's still more. Told you, it was a long one. So sometimes physical blows occur between parents and other adults in the house. So 14 to 16, still the first 18 years. How often, if ever, did you see or hear a parent, step parent, or another adult who was helping to raise you being yelled at, screamed at, sworn at, insulted, or humiliated? You notice this isn't saying mother anymore. It's anybody who is helping raise you. So would you say 1, many times, 2, a few times, 3, once, 4, never? And then number 15, how often, if ever, did you see or hear in your home a parent, step parent, or another adult who is helping raise you being slapped, kicked, punched, or beaten up? 1, many times. 2, a few times. 3, once, and 4, never. And 16, how often, if ever, did you see or hear a parent, step parent, or another adult who was helping to raise you being hit or cut with an object, such as a stick or cane, bottle, club, knife, or gun? 1, many times. 2, a few times. 3, once. 4, never. Sometimes parents or other adults hurt children. While you were growing up, that is during the first 18 years of life, how often, if ever, did a parent, step parent, or another adult living in your home, 17, swear at you, insult you, or put you down? 1, more than once. 2, once. Or 3, never. And number 18, push, grab, shove, or slap you. 1, more than once. 2, once. 3, never. Number 19, hit you so hard that you had marks or were injured. 1, more than once. 2, once. 3, never. You might even have don't know, not sure, because you might have had an older sibling say it happened when you were younger. 20, act in a way that made you afraid that you would be physically hurt. 1, more than once. 2, once. 3, never. And again, you might not have been sure, but you feel like there were times when you were afraid. Halfway through. So keep going. Some people, while growing up in their first 18 years, had a sexual experience with an adult or someone at least 5 years older than themselves. That was very specific. These experiences may have involved a relative, family friend, or stranger. During the first 18 years of life, did an adult or older relative, family friend, or stranger who is at least 5 years older than yourself ever, 21, touch or fondle you in a sexual way, or have you touch their body in a sexual way? 1, yes. 2, no. And again, you might not be sure. Or refuse. 22, attempt to have or actually have any type of sexual intercourse, oral, anal, vaginal with you. 1, yes. 2, no. And you can also have, just not sure because don't want to talk about it, or refuse. So these have to do with your health and well-being. Have you ever been told by a doctor or other health professional that you have or had any of these medical conditions or illnesses? And this is trying to make the linkage, okay? 23, angina, coronary heart disease, heart attack, myocardial infarction. Yes, no, don't know. 24, stroke, small stroke, TIA, anything like that. CVA. Yes, no, don't know. Chronic bronchitis, emphysema. Yes, no, don't know. Broken any bones? Yes, no, don't know. Yellow jaundice, hepatitis, or liver trouble? Yes, no, don't know. And then the conglomeration of sexually transmitted infections, like chlamydia, gonorrhea, syphilis, trichomoniasis. Yes, no, don't know, really don't want to talk about it. All right, now they get into the deep stuff, the sexual relationships. How old were you the first time you had sex? You could answer never had sex, or you don't know. There was no number 30. I looked for it. I checked several sources. Maybe they deleted number 30. I don't know. They put it in there to confuse me. I could not find a number 30. But anyway, how many different sex partners have you had? That probably made for some interesting data gathering. More than 100, don't know, refused, etc. And you read some ranges, and then they put it in there so that they'd have some ranges. And then, have you ever been pregnant or gotten someone pregnant? So almost done. So if you're talking to a female, they would say, when your first pregnancy began, did you intend that pregnancy? And if it's a male, when you first got someone, when you got someone pregnant for the first time, did you intend that pregnancy? And female, how old were you when you first became pregnant? And male, how old were you when you got someone pregnant? Again, I think they're looking at sort of youth sexual behavior in this mostly. All right, I threw a funny picture of me in because I think this survey is getting long and I thought you needed a goofy. So, and again, this is Gatlinburg, Tennessee. They have a penguin colony I often visit. So, have you ever used or injected illicit drugs, such as marijuana? That's their word. I call it cannabis. Cocaine, crack, hallucinogens, inhalants, heroin, or taken prescription drugs that were not prescribed to you, like Oxy or Xanax, Adderall, etc. Yes, no, don't know. Don't know what I take, right? In the past year, have you had 2 or more weeks of being depressed, feeling down, depressed, hopeless, etc.? Have you ever attempted to commit suicide? Did you grow up in Philadelphia? Now, if you answer yes, this shortens the survey significantly. If you don't, it's interesting. They ask them, what state did you grow up in? Okay. And what country did you grow up in? So they must have had some people that were living in Philadelphia, but may not have been there the first 18 years of their life. So then, and I thought this was fascinating, they picked these places, and I don't know whether these were the places that a lot of people come to Philadelphia from or what, but they actually picked these places for them to check. And if it isn't any of those places, then you fill in that final place. Okay, so what were the findings? Well, they were sort of interesting. In Philadelphia, they found that 7 in 10 adults had at least one ACE study. But if you think back to the original ACE study, I remember saying to you 3 weeks ago that a third of the original ACE study had a 0. Remember that? Well, that's one way of saying 7 in 10 had experienced at least one. So isn't that interesting that whether it was in Philadelphia or it was the California study, it looks like inside the home, you had at least a third that didn't have any dysfunction. Things were fine. But that's sad because it means 7 in 10 did in both of those studies. 2 in 5 had experienced 4 or more, which remember was the critical value, that at that point you should have an intervention. So we're looking at 40% had need for an intervention. So the community level indicators they teased out. I don't know if you noticed on those numbers, but if you tried to add them up, it makes no sense because sometimes you got high numbers for good stuff and sometimes you got high numbers for bad stuff. So that wasn't really looking for a number. It was actually looking for data. But they found that 40% of Philadelphians had experienced 4 or more bad stuff in the expanded community level. So we're looking at 40% household, 40% community level ACEs. And that's what all those questions boil down to. I mean, you can look at the study. I can give you the link and they'll actually send you the whole study. But this is the good part. What did you all think of that? And without sharing your score, unless you want to, there's really not a score. But what did you think of the questions in this study? Shall I stop share so we can see each other,
Or if anybody wants to share, they can just turn their mic on.
okay?
I don't want to go first only because I'll talk up all the time. But anybody, what was your reflection on the questions that Nina was asking?
And you don't have to say it's me. You can say you're asking for a friend. No, I'm just kidding. Well, did you think it was a well-built study?
I see Mary with her mic off. I don't know if you want to say anything or if the mic just went off.
No, I think my mic is on, isn't it? Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, no, I think it was a lot more well-rounded. I still think they missed the mark in some areas. I felt like there were questions that could have been answered while I was going through the questions, which have escaped my mind at this time, but they did a much better job, obviously, this time around.
It was very in-depth. These were
was.
actual interviews. And I thought to myself, how many people got up and walked out when you got to the heavy stuff?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, Nina. Some of the questions, I mean, they didn't occur to me. That didn't happen in my life. But I thought if someone had experienced that in their life, and now this, interviewer just asked them these questions and they keep asking more sensitive questions. And then the person gets up and leaves the interview and needs some, mental illness intervention, but they didn't get it because they were just, it's just the way we are. We're going to go to interview. They're going to tell us these horrible, and we're going to reflect on some horrible experiences like child molestation or something,
Yeah, you wonder if they had something where if somebody stormed out, they caught them and said, hey, let's
you hope there was some kind of debriefing. How are you feeling? Would you like to, follow up over the next couple of weeks and call us if you feel strange about some of the questions? And maybe they did do that. I don't know. But that was my only, the questions were sensitive. And sometimes you wonder if people will be honest with sensitive questions.
Well, Kevin, last time I'm drawing Kevin out, but last time you were not happy about the definitions. Were you happier about, remember at the header, it would say, it's not just your mom, it's anybody.
Oh yeah. We were saying there could be other people in the home, and it did mention a step parent.
Better definitions, do you think, this time?
Yeah, I think it was certainly more comprehensive in terms of the types of events that they were searching for and the specificity of the details about those events in terms of frequency and so forth. But the categories I think were fine. I mean, you do have to include a wider base of, homes that have a variety of parent models or single parents, or now it's grandma and uncles and other people living there too, who could be doing these acts. It's not always the parent. So I think
did you notice
like
what
the
was
whole
missing?
household of adults. And is any adults in the household acting this way, not just dad,
Oh yeah, absolutely. It might have been mom, and many times it is mom. And they were sort of singling out the last time, is mom mistreated? Well, it could be any number. It could be grandma who's looking after you or whatever. Did you see what was missing? I'm sure Mary saw what was missing.
No, I don't think I saw what was missing, but I feel that school had a big part of my upbringing, which it was only indirectly addressed here.
That's true. Why didn't they sort of drill down on who are bullied at school? I would have liked to see that, but I didn't see a whole lot on divorce and incarceration. Like that's so
Mhm,
evil.
mhm.
Maybe because it is ubiquitous. They didn't drill down on that at all. Whereas
Mhm,
the
mhm.
last one made it sound like, oh, that's 1 in 10 because your parents got separated or divorced or because
True.
somebody went to prison. They didn't in Philadelphia, they didn't make that sound like that was something they wanted to they had far more on your sexual life than that. And they specifically asked about your health in this.
Dr. Beeman, this
Yes.
is Jennifer. Hi. A couple
Hi,
things I
Jennifer.
noticed. Hi. A couple things I noticed was when they were talking about mental illness and suicide, they strictly focused on who was in the home. What about a grandparent? How did that affect you? You know, so I think there was a lot of things that were strictly just in the home, where a lot of this occurs outside the immediate home and it's still traumatizing. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And I also felt that I also agree with you about the number system. If it's something is positive, you're giving yourself high numbers versus a negative, which were lower numbers. It didn't make sense. So
Yeah, I
but there
think they
must
were
be some
trying to not
logic.
have you psych it out so that you were, with the ACE study, right? You want a low number, right? And
Right, right.
you can't figure this one out.
No, I agree. Thank you.
Oh, sure.
Is this open discussion, Nina, or are you just pausing in
Yeah,
your
yeah, it's pretty much
open?
the end. Yeah,
Okay,
we're
cool.
pretty open.
Yeah. Anybody else have anything else to share? You know, as I was listening through this, Nina, the thing that popped into my mind too were, how many of these things are correlates? In other words, as I abuse drugs, I might be more likely to abuse my family. You know what I mean? Or because I live in an abusive environment, then I choose to abuse drugs to help me deal with that. You don't know the
What they were
directionality
trying
of
to
which is
do.
causing
Can you
which,
link
but
this number with this variable, like their illness or their sexual risks, with what you answered in a different number? That's why I think they aren't looking for a score.
yeah.
They're
But
more of a survey.
the main thing that I think is one of the biggest struggles on any kind of relationship will always almost be finances, right? And so if you're poor, if you live in poverty, you automatically live in a higher stressful environment, because you're struggling to make bills and you're struggling to feed the family and keep the electricity on. And like you said, you live probably in a community that may have more crime because it's you got to afford the rent where you can afford it, and it might not be the best area. And now when you leave your home, you're exposed to all this stuff all around you. And you get upset on the bus, and or someone yells at you and cuts you off in somewhere, and then by the time you get home, you're worked up maybe, and you come into an environment where now it's already another stressful thing that happened. Someone lost their job that day, and you got to come home to that. And then you see how people can kind of lose their control a little bit and misbehave, and they don't do it intentionally. I don't think these people are bad people. I just think they might not have proper coping skills and know a different way to behave, or they don't realize the power of who's watching. The other thing I was thinking here is this concept of vicarious learning. And that's a lot of what we're talking about here. If I see someone in my home environment, my very earliest school of life, where I learn everything, basically before I go to school, and they're solving their problems through violence and aggression, then and I go out into my community and there's fights by people bullying each other in the streets and etc., then that vicarious impact on you shapes your selection of choices when you experience those same things. And we are creatures of habit. We very much do the things the way we were taught. Spanking, I know it's supposed to be a bad thing, and y'all probably thought I was spanked a lot, but I really wasn't, because I played the vicarious learning role. I watched someone else get spanked and I said, well, I don't want to do what they did. I just watched them go run through the house screaming and hollering, and being loud, and then they got spanked. Well, I'm not going to run through the house screaming and hollering. So at least I can learn vicariously what not to do. But you can also learn vicariously maladaptive behaviors. And because no one in the environment will see that maladaptive behavior as being maladaptive, you're never corrected about a better choice. And so therefore they may reinforce that maladaption. You're running around being more aggressive, and to them, that may be something they reinforce. You do hear parents sometimes, don't ever let anybody beat you up on the playground. You better stand your ground and blah, blah, blah. And, that's a model. That's a form of violence, and it's, again, a leader, a person, a parent, an adult who's very influential in your life when you're a child. You talked about the Israeli children, and yesterday, Hamas, they're obviously people who've been exposed now, their home life, but their community. I mean, their community is hyper violent. If you look at many of the things that happen sometimes in the Middle Eastern countries, when things go wrong, it's chaos. Everybody's screaming and hollering and carrying bodies over their head and yelling. There's not any calm to try to take care of the situation. It's just mayhem. They're dragging bodies from rubble and everything and running through the streets and screaming. And it seems like the environment promotes greater, violence instead of approaching it calmly. But I can understand you may feel like you're at the end of all your options. Poor people can feel that way too. I'm at the end of all my options. Therefore, I respond in this way to my children or my husband or my wife or my grandmother or whoever. And now the children see that, or other adults can see that and learn to behave that way too. But to go back to these Hamas children, or these children who were kidnapped by Hamas, again, their whole upbringing wasn't that way. But when they were released, I don't know if y'all saw this, when they were released by Hamas, they got into the back of these vans that were by the Red Cross, and were waving and smiling goodbye to the Hamas kidnappers. And I thought that was very bizarre. That really stood out to me. I did hear some comment, some of the news people comment on that. But I thought they were just kidnapped. Some of them witnessed their families being murdered and shot live in the kibbutz as they were pulled out of it and drug away by strangers and not. And then when they were released, they waved almost like they were, friends with these people. And I was curious, we've heard about this where people in the Holocaust, you have 500 people in a room and only two guards. 5 of you could swarm the 2 guards, but everybody walked right into the gas chamber knowing they're all going to go die, and just, cooperated and become very passive in their own capture, their own captivity, and their own trauma, let's call it. Same with children here in the ACE study. Do we get to a point where we that effect takes I don't know what it's called, the Stockholm syndrome or something like that, where you become compassionate towards your abusers. You see them in sympathy in some way. You're thankful to them because they could have been worse, and they were kind to you because they starve you for 3 days, but then they give you a piece of their bread and you think they're just the biggest hero in the world because they gave you a moment of kindness. Do we see those? Did the ACE study just not maybe look at that? I know your background in forensic nursing may touch on that, but I wonder, are there overlaps between the things that we hear, like the Stockholm syndrome, and then things that we see with children who experience trauma?
Well, children by nature are helpless. They are dependent upon adults. And so in their childhood, they often do, I spoke about this in bunnies and stuff, they do whatever they need to survive. And so if they're dependent on somebody for food, they'll do, like you said, they'll behave, they'll do what they need to survive. When we're going to see this is down the road in adulthood, when they can make their own choices, in substance abuse, in PTSD, in broken families, and not feeling secure in their own homes, in needing a therapy animal, for example. And that's sort of why they're doing these back studies of what happened to you in the first 18 years of your life, because in the first 18 years, it's just the nature of a child to cope with whoever is dominating them. But when they become adults, can they make decisions like I did? I'm going to help people so nobody has to feel like I did. Nobody has to feel unsafe around me because I'm going to make sure they feel safe. That's a positive way to take a negative experience? Or am I going to torment people like I was tormented when I was a kid, you know? And that's the way some people take it, unfortunately. Probably some of those captors, that was their experience. So what we have to do, and you're sort of segueing to my next two sessions, is as a community, think these things have already been done to these children. How can we take that and turn it, because I do believe positively about people. And I think everybody who works for Aspen believes that we can take a student and we can make a good Aspen experience produce a good Aspen graduate, you know? But where do we factor in that they come to us having, and you know, I love the word cracked, you know, they're not broken, but they might have a little cracked. They might be a little cracked, right? So how do we pour super glue into the crack, and help to heal whatever it is that is their past trauma? You know, I had a third grade teacher, I'll tell you this, that said, you can't write at all and you'll never amount to anything. And I want to find her and tell her I have a doctorate and I know how to keystroke on a computer. You know? It doesn't really matter that I can't write cursives very well, but or couldn't back then. But she was sure I'd never amount to anything because I couldn't use cursive writing very well. And you know, maybe that was important to her. I was certainly important to my mom, but I don't know that calling me a loser was particularly motivating, or keeping me in. You know, keeping me in from recess was her punishment for me. And I sat there and I wrote lines, you know, wrote the same thing over and over and over again. Like, that's motivating. And since then, now, new education has said, if I had gone out and jumped rope and done things that were eye to hand coordination, that I might have been able to write better in cursive. And I'm like, wow, I love that study. You know, so again, I think we've learned, you know, from the ACE report, how not to treat children, you know, and from the Philadelphia report, how not to treat children. The question is, what are we going to do with that, you know, information, so that we can have a future generation of positive contributing citizens? But this study, I think, is superior to the previous study. It certainly drills down on different things, and it doesn't have the bias, as Mary pointed out, of if your family divorced or went to prison, therefore you're impacted negatively. You might not have been. You might be glad that dad went off to prison. Yeah, that might have been a rescue, you know, for you. So there was a lot of bias in the other study, and this is really, to Kevin's point, taking this happened to you, and then this was what later you did as a risky behavior or an illness that you got. This actually, because it isn't looking for a number, is actually looking for a correlation. And that's a better constructed study in my book. Anybody have any other comments about the study? Did you like it better? It certainly would take more time to administer, but it probably got better data.
I liked it better, Dr. Beeman, but obviously, because it was a lot more extensive. But I'm going to call up again. You just brought to mind about the school situation. I was afraid of a lot of my teachers, and a lot of my teachers did things that were not very nice when I was growing up. And with my son, he actually has, I believe, a lasting scar from his teacher in 4th grade that used him as an example of what not to do and what a failure is like, which humiliated him. And I did not even, he was so humiliated, he couldn't even tell me about it until years later when I questioned him. That, to me, school education has a huge impact on children, because you're looking at those adults as replacements or peers to what your parents do. It's almost as if they take over the job when your parent is not there.
Well, COVID worked for my benefit. I have a grandson who was being bullied by a teacher, and they had, you know, when COVID hit, it was in home. And I was in the home, so I could hear her bullying. And I won't, without going into a lot of it, I went to his therapist and reported it as abusive.
Good for you.
And she went to the principal and reported it as abusive. And by the next day, he was in a different class.
Excellent.
But I wouldn't have known that you're right. I don't think he ever would have said anything to me. And I wasn't in the classroom. She was busted because we were online and I could monitor it, you know, so.
You made a comment earlier, Nina, that you said sometimes when two people like parents don't get along, divorce is the right answer, because once they get divorced, then all these other things that we were just talking about that occur in the home aren't occurring anymore. Right? So you save all the years of these occurrences of stuff when the divorce happens. It was the same thing with this teacher and your grandson. They basically got a divorce.
Yes.
And it prevented the continuous, you know, daily abuse that would have shaped him into the future. And he may have grown up to do some of the stuff that we just said happens as later in life, you know, negative side effects. But you help divorce them too. And so sometimes getting away from the scenario is the solution. The problem is, like y'all just mentioned, when I live in a home that's abusive and I try to get away from it by going to school, and now my teacher and peers bully me and etc., then I don't, you know, then you wonder why they grow up. You don't wonder, I guess I should say, why they grow up and sometimes have violent tendencies. And
well, next year there was a wonderful teacher. And I always thought in the back of my mind that maybe that teacher had been bullied, because somehow he really understood the needs of bullied kids. He just got it. And so I always wondered, maybe he was bullied as a little boy. And that's what I'm saying. It doesn't have to go bad. It doesn't have to be, well, I was bullied, so I'm going to turn out to be, you know, a terrorist. No, maybe I can be empathetic to what it feels like to be a little bullied boy, you know, and so then I become a 5th grade teacher because I know what it's like to be a little bullied boy. I mean, really, it can go the other way, that we can use.
Danger here,
this.
Nina, is social media.
Mhm.
Because the stuff that we were saying, now I have to be in the home where that occurs. I have to be out in the community. I have to be in a school where, if I'm not in any of those environments, but I have my phone in my face as a teenager for 7, 8, 9 hours a day, all the way to 2 o'clock in the morning, you know, staring at your, and all the stuff that you see on there is violence and misabuse and yelling at people. Some of the most viral videos that you will see online will be teenagers fighting and beating each other up in bathrooms at school. It's like the biggest thing that they all want to do is show each other in their videos beating each other up. You know, somebody just got killed.
And again, you might live in a wonderful, peaceful household,
yeah,
but this is what Philadelphia looked at. But
social
your
media, I'm
community,
saying you can't escape.
Yes, social media is your
or whatever,
community.
they didn't have that impact, although that was the first ACE study. The one in Philadelphia still was 10 years old. I'm sure social media was available then. It just isn't as prominent, I don't feel, as now. There's so much vicarious brain shaping that takes place when you're staring at a screen, and the messages on that screen will affect you and make you think a certain way, whether you think you're going to think that way or not. You get enough exposure to a screen that programs your brain to think and feel a certain way, then you will. And
Another,
that may be where you get the violence from. Sorry, Jennifer, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I thought you had finished. The other thing is our communities, not all of them, but our law enforcement are not necessarily the most helpful in certain situations. And when they allow it to happen, and the schools allow it to happen, then you have, you know, 6-year-olds shooting teachers and things like that. My granddaughter's in a classroom that we've tried to get her out of because she has boys that will hit her and punch her in the stomach. And we go to the, you know, my daughter goes to the principal and she says that, you know, they're not getting in the middle of it and they're gonna, you know, so they punish them, maybe one or the other, depending on the situation. And, you know, it's just teaching them to go on acting that way, and they're not helping the situation. It's very frustrating as a parent and grandparent when you can't get the help you need. And that's a big issue too.
I think that I would take to the school board. I mean, they're elected officials, at least in
Yes,
Virginia they
yes.
are. That's serious.
Yes,
Bullying.
You know, one of my daughters was assaulted at school and the principal didn't do anything. I went to the sheriff
Yeah.
Okay,
because they
thank you.
are afraid of law enforcement, and there are laws against assaulting any human being.
How old is
Doesn't
how old's
matter.
your daughter, Jennifer?
My daughter,
The one that was being bullied, punched in the stomach?
oh, the granddaughter, well, she was 4 and 5, and now she's
very young.
just turned 6. So
Okay,
little.
well, still, I was about to say again, we're just on social media. You know, everybody has cell phones, so when this stuff takes place, record it. Tell your child, the student in the classroom, when the teacher's yelling and screaming, to record it. I mean, literally, and that will stop this stuff. You have to capture it. You do see that on the internet too, where you see, you know, a teacher say something inappropriate and it shocks you to see it, but we would have never known that unless it was recorded.
Right.
I think
You're using
yeah, you know, whenever we
using
witness
media
this stuff in
to help.
society. Yeah, you
I
have to be
mean,
careful, 'cause
I
when you
always
record,
felt
they may
safe at
attack you, you
school.
know.
I mean, our kids must feel, how can they learn if they don't feel safe at school?
I don't know how they can feel safe at school with all the shootings and,
Mm-hmm.
you know, people, teachers and, you know, students, you know, being allowed to be bullies and that type of thing. What I've noticed is that the online schools my one granddaughter has online, and they seem to be very helpful. You know, they met with us and they're, you know, we've got a plan in place for helping her with her schoolwork. But then I watched her sister who's in public, and, you know, it's horrible.
It's almost like they've given it up. The serious students are going online or homeschooling or wherever. And what does that leave but these bullies that want to bully each other? And
Yes.
wow, yikes.
That's what it seems like.
Well,
Well, we're going to have a robust community discussion, aren't we?
It is a good conversation. I always hate to cut it off when it's good, but we are at limit.
No, but
save
that's
some
why
of your
this
questions
study
for
is
next
good.
time. Okay, good.
Yeah.
Go
So
ahead,
December the 5th, we'll talk about exactly what we were just wanting to talk about, but we'll continue it and then solve all of the world's in the session 4.
All right. Thank you.
Bye, y'all. Thank you for your
Bye.
time.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Next week is the next presentation. It's not 2 weeks from now. It's 1 week. See y'all next Tuesday.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.